I had always been a dutiful wife, doing everything in my power to keep my home running smoothly and to take care of my two young sons, Bernard and Bruno. But ever since my husband's mother came to live with us, things had become unimaginably difficult. When Edward and I first met, he was charming, kind, confident, and successful. He ran two very successful businesses. One was an automobile shop, and the other one was a very large accounting firm. I, on the other hand, was merely an accountant who worked at his accounting firm. That's actually how we met. It's a funny story, really. One day, I was running late for work. It was one of those days where nothing seemed to go my way. My alarm didn't go off, or at least I didn't hear it. And because I didn't hear it go off, I missed my train. When I got into the office building, I also missed the elevator I was running so quickly to catch up to because I tripped and spilled my coffee all over my cream cashmere sweater. Like I said, it was one of those days. As I sat there in the reception crying, I heard a calm, deep voice ask me, "Are you okay?" When I looked up, it was him. It was Edward, my boss. I couldn't believe it. Yes, sir, I'm fine, I said as I tried to quickly wipe my tears. Is it okay? He asked me. Darla, I responded immediately, understanding that he was asking for my name. It's okay, Darla. We all have moments when we need to let it out, he said calmly. I am not having a very good day myself, he continued. Why are you sitting out here, though? He asked as he looked around. It was obvious that from a professional point of view, it wasn't a good look to have a woman with coffee-stained clothes crying in the reception. I'm sorry, I missed the elevator, I replied. Why don't you come with me? We can use my elevator, he said with his right hand stretched out towards me. He not only allowed me to use his private elevator, but he also asked his assistant to have my clothes laundered. That day, I barely worked. I was in his office for most of the day. He told me how his fiancée had just broken up with him and how his day had started out rough as well. We had a deep connection instantly. Or so I thought. He took me out to lunch, and the rest is history. So you can imagine, he not only made more money than me, but he was also more attractive. I couldn't believe my luck, and at times, I wondered what he saw in me. Don't get me wrong, I'm far from bad looking, but he was just one of those people who seemed to have it all together. The first year of our marriage was a fairy tale. He would leave me little gifts and notes around the house for me to find. My favorite note was the one that said, "You're a dream come true, you light up my life." He was absolutely perfect. Unfortunately, the romance started to dwindle once I gave birth to our second son, Bruno. He was still sweet and helpful around the house, but he had developed a nasty habit of making snarky comments about my weight. One night, we were having dinner, and Edward looked at me from across the table and said, "Hey babe, if you get pregnant again, no one is going to know." "What do you mean?" I asked. I was confused and I knew it showed on my face. "'Cause, you know," said Edward as he waved his fork in my general direction. "No, sorry, I don't," I said. I was starting to get angry at that point. "Must I say it?" he asked. Yeah," I snapped. "Babe, calm down. I was just joking," he said. Implying that I am fat because I just had your child is not a joke, I replied. After I said that, I picked up my plate, which I had barely touched. I couldn't eat my meal anymore. He often made remarks or jokes, as he would call them, from time to time. But I knew just how to handle him, and he would always stand down when he noticed I was getting upset. Everything took a turn for the worst once my mother-in-law arrived for a short vacation. At first, I tried to make the best of the situation. After all, my mother-in-law was my husband's family, and I wanted to do everything I could to make her feel welcome in our home. But no matter what I did, she seemed to find fault with everything. It started with little things at first, like the way I folded the laundry or the way I cooked dinner. One Sunday morning, she went out to order fast food for herself and my husband for breakfast. When I decided to know why, she simply said, "Darling, your meals are a tad dry and either too bland or too salty. Once you find some balance, I'll stop buying takeout to feed my son and grandbabies." I was so upset that I couldn't even say anything. I just went ahead to eat the breakfast I had already prepared and cleaned up the kitchen. Before long, it seemed like she was finding fault with everything I did, and my husband seemed to take her side in everything. It wasn't just that they were critical of me, but they also both enjoyed those cruel jokes my husband cracked more often and more brutal each day. It's like she fueled his cruelty and disdain towards me. They treated me like a servant, no worse, like a slave. They ordered me around and expected me to drop everything to take care of their every whim. And when I protested, they would just laugh and tell me it was my duty as a wife to take care of them. Edward would sometimes say, "You could learn a thing or two from my mum if you stopped nagging." I finally had enough when my husband screamed at me and belittled me for not following his food timetable. "You are so darn incompetent. You don't work or contribute to the house in any way. I ask absolutely nothing of you. I don't even ask you to look presentable. The only thing I ask you to do, you can't even do it right." He yelled at me, pushed his plate off the dining table. "I told you, dear, she's a lazy slob," added Margaret, his mother. I cried myself to sleep that night. I had never felt more worthless in my entire life. I had wanted to get a job. There were many occasions when I had begged my husband to allow me to work. He always refused and insisted that there was no need. He said his income was more than enough. "Let me take care of you and your bills. All you have to do is take care of our kids and your beautiful self," he often said. It was a difficult situation to say the least, but I knew that I couldn't just sit back and take it. I didn't have the mental capacity to take any more of their abuse. I decided I had to do something to get my revenge. So I started plotting. I knew that my husband and mother-in-law both had their weaknesses, and I was determined to exploit them, just like they had exploited my love and weakness. The first step of my plan was to start acting like a dutiful wife again. I cleaned the house from top to bottom every day and never complained. I made sure that dinner was always on the table and the food was always on time. I even followed Margaret's favorite family recipes to the letter. I did their laundry and ran errands for them, but at the same time, I started planting seeds of doubts in their mind. "Why do you always order me around like I'm your servant?" I asked my husband one day. "Don't you think it's time you start treating me like a partner instead of a servant? He didn't say anything, but I could tell that my words had hit home. He always loved to think of himself as a modern man who was against the patriarchy, which is the reason I said to him, while sounding slightly amused instead of sounding sad and frustrated like I usually did. I knew it would be the best course of action. It seems he actually thought about it. And from that day on, he started treating me with a bit more respect. He started calling me honey again and started saying please when he asked me to do something. To be very honest, I think those are the only things that's changed. Oh yeah, and the jokes at my expense were less frequent. But my mother-in-law was a tougher nut to crack. She was a stern woman who seemed to take pleasure in making me miserable. But I knew that she had a soft spot for her grandchildren. She would usually say, "Thank God, they look just like their dad," as if to imply that it would have been a problem if they looked like me. She often bought them gifts. At times, it seemed like she wanted to replace me as their mother so desperately that she would question my mothering skills. She always tried to tell me to be a mother to my own children. It was always one thing or the other. For instance, she would say things like, "Oh, that's not how you play with a 2-year-old," or "Those clothes are not suitable for the children of a successful businessman." One day, she took it too far when she asked, "Darla, why do you neglect your children?" I was so furious that I stormed out of the house. Seeing that she loved my kids so much, I decided it was a perfect place to strike. I knew it was cruel of me, but this was war, and I wasn't taking prisoners. I started taking the boys out more often, showing them off to my mother-in-law and making sure that they got plenty of attention. And before long, I could see the change in her. She started treating me with a bit more respect and even started giving me her version of compliments on my cooking and cleaning. "This meal is acceptable" became her new slogan, even if it was her absolute favorite dish I cooked. I never got anything higher than acceptable, but at least that was better than what she would say before. It was a slow process, but it was working. I was in no hurry because I was also using the time to get back in shape. I not only wanted to feel my best, I also wanted to look my best. To be honest, looking good was important to my plan. And before long, I knew that I had them right where I wanted them. Then, one fateful day, I decided to strike. I had been planning this for weeks, and I was confident it was going to work. It was a Saturday morning, and my husband and mother-in-law were both sitting in the living room, drinking their coffee. My mother-in-law was reading a newspaper, and my husband was on his phone, looking very concentrated, no doubts replying to emails. My 2 boys were seated on the floor watching cartoons. I walked in with a big smile on my face, carrying a tray of freshly baked chocolate chip muffins. "Good morning, everyone," I said cheerfully. "I made muffins for breakfast." They both looked up at me in surprise. My mother-in-law seemed suspicious. Maybe call it woman's intuition? But my husband just smiled and took a muffin. "They're delicious, honey," he said, taking a big bite. He couldn't resist chocolate chip muffins. They were his favorite. My mother-in-law just sniffed as if she was suspicious of poison. Then, to my surprise, she actually took a tiny nibble of her muffin. I could see the look of pleasure on her face as she chewed. And then I dropped the bombshell. "I have something to tell you both," I said, setting down the tray of muffins. "Oh, what is it, dear?" he said aloofly, still peering at his phone screen. "I'm leaving you." They both looked up at me in shock. "What?" my husband asked in surprise. His face was so pale, like he had just seen a ghost. No doubt he never saw this coming. "Yes, Eddie, you heard me right. I'm sick and tired of being pushed around, picked on, and treated like a slave by you and your mother. I am tired, feeling like nothing I do is never enough, like I'm not enough and never will be." "A slave?" his mother said. "You are a woman. You only do what a loving wife is supposed to do. I have never asked more than that of you," my husband said. "What about what a loving husband is supposed to do?" I asked. "I pay the bills, don't I?" he asked me. "And that's where it ends," I replied with a sigh. "What do you mean?" he asked, feigning confusion as usual. "You take jabs at my looks and my body. You make me feel like a troll. Oh, wait, you've actually called me a troll before," I responded. "Listen, baby, please," he said as he finally stood up from his chair to walk towards me. "You know I was only joking, come on. You look nothing like a troll, you're so beautiful," he said, stepping closer towards me. Then I stepped back. "What is wrong with women of this generation? They're all so darn sensitive," she said, showing no remorse at all. I ignored the both of them and took off my apron. In that moment, the apron symbolized our marriage. I think my husband realized it. After all, he was always so good at reading me. "Darla, honey, I can change," he said, looking very weak. He even lost his balance a little. I guess his legs were shaking. I would stop making silly jokes. You know I never meant to hurt you," he continued. His voice was breaking as well. "It's not just about the so-called jokes, Edward. It's everything. Look, I've already talked to my lawyer and we're getting a divorce," I said sternly. "I told you she was no good. In my days, a woman would never complain about her duties," my mother-in-law said to my husband, determined to be looped into the conversation. But unfortunately, he also ignored her. "Is that so, Margaret? You're still a woman, aren't you? So why don't you pick up after yourself?" I replied to her. Since she wanted in on the conversation, I was nice enough to give her what she wanted. She was speechless. I had never spoken to Margaret like that before. The most I'd do is storm out. But this time, I had had enough. After responding to my mother-in-law, I left the living room because I was done with the back and forth. I went upstairs where I already had my bags packed. I took my sons with me and we went to my sister's house. My sister was in full support of my decision. She never really liked him from the beginning. She always said there was something off about him. "Darla, no one can be this perfect," she would say. I thought she was jealous, but now I see she was right on the money. Edward refused to sign the divorce papers and instead badgered me with constant phone calls and endless voicemails, all saying the same thing. It was like a weird routine. I got a minimum of 10 voicemails a day. The first few voicemails would sound like, "My love, my mom has left our house and she's not coming back, I promise. She was the problem and she's gone." Or, "I love you, just please come home. I miss you and the boys." Then, his ego would get hurt by my silence and the next few would sound like, "Who do you think you are? There are many women who want me. You should be happy I'm even considering taking you back. It was a vicious cycle. Then one day, my husband finally signed the papers. He still gets to see our boys every weekend, but I avoid him as much as possible. I am very happy with my decision and I'm slowly getting independent again.